Thank you guys for having me. Today we're going to talk about solver risk is too damn high. So a little bit of background on myself. I'm the co-founder of Nomial. We're building an open liquidity network for the chain abstracted future. That's a lot of words, big words, but what we're really doing is making it easier for solvers to connect to capital on different chains and trying to solve the chain fragmentation, liquidity fragmentation problem by making it easy for a solver to borrow capital on a destination chain that they want to fill on and repay in a centralized, localized set of chains so that they don't need to hold capital across many different chains. So I could talk about that more at the end if anyone wants me to, but I'm going to try and avoid shilling too much. So yeah, find me on Twitter, Andrew311, Nomial_IO for Nomial. Okay, so if you could take away anything from this, what I'm trying to get you to take away is that I'm encouraging you to build solvers and solver infrastructure, particularly for intent-based bridges. And let's just talk about what I mean by intent-based bridge really briefly. We've kind of talked about them a little bit already, so I'll go through this quickly. If anyone wants to find more information on this, you can check out a number of different sources, which I'm going to include at the end. So basically, to me, and I know we all have different definitions of intents. I'm not going to address the question of is an intent a limit order, but to me, for an intent-based bridge, effectively, it works like this. A user has an intent to trade or swap something across two chains. So they submit that to an origin chain bridge contract. Effectively, they escrow their input assets by doing so, although not necessarily, but that's a detail. There's more complexity there. But let's just pretend that that causes them to escrow some input assets. From there, solvers bid on executing that order. And some solver ends up winning the bid. And the bid, I also use that term a little bit lightly because this works in different ways depending on what intent-based bridge we're talking about. But you can think about it as bidding. So solver wins. So now there's going to be a solver that's going to execute. So the solver fills the intent by providing the output asset on the destination chain. Then something like a settlement oracle, messaging layer, something verifies that that happens. And we've already talked about that in multiple talks today. And once that's verified, the solver gets to take their input asset, the input asset from the bridge contract and that escrow, and then bam, they're paid. So that's this to me is what an intent-based bridge is really all about. The advantage of this is speed. The user gets to fill almost instantly, and that's what we're really trying to solve for here. There are other kinds of bridges that have different trade-offs, but really, as we've talked about in other talks, you're trying to solve for speed. And the solver is taking on the risk of, do I get repaid or not? But solvers are more sophisticated than probably lots of users, so that's a good trade-off to make. But we're going to talk a little bit more about that risk in a second. So now that we have the context, let's talk about risks. And I mean risks in two different ways, primarily for the purpose of this talk. One is the solver's risks that they take on, and two, like systemic ecosystem risks for bridging in this architecture and things that we should be thinking about. Okay, so here's something I want to highlight. There was a really good post from Li-Fi, however you say it. The QR code's right there if anyone wants to scan it and read it later. They did a little bit of a deep dive on the transactions and the volume going through intent-based bridges. I'm not going to call out specific intent-based bridges because I don't want to call attention to anyone in particular, but I think there's some really interesting findings here. One is this one. So this is a pie chart showing the number of bids on orders over their observation period from relatively recently. And as you can see, it's mostly one color, and that one color corresponds to one bid. So what we take away from this is that most orders only have one bid. Now, that's interesting. Why is that? And we could even debate if that's bad or good, and some other talks have done already. But that's interesting. The other thing to think about here is distribution of these orders among different solvers. So without going too deep on this, because we don't have too much time, what I'm really trying to highlight with this particular graph is how much order flow is being taken by specific solvers. So I'll point it out right here. This is the column you want to be looking at. As you can see, A lot of the order flow on this particular bridge is being taken by one solver. And if you dig into a lot of these addresses, there's pretty strong indication that many of them are affiliated. So even, like, this is not all disparate solvers. There's a good indication that this is probably only a couple, 3, 4, 5 solvers tops. And if you dig into it even further, a lot of these solvers are affiliated with the bridges too. So, man, lots of centralization risk going on here. Why is this problematic? Well, it could lead to suboptimal pricing, potentially, but if you have a limit order, you're at least protected from some level of price gouging. Where I personally feel that there's a lot of risk is censorship resistance and also single points of failure, which is kind of two sides of the same coin. If a government decided they want to go after a solver, they could whack basically a ton of routes in a day by forcing that solver to go offline. Or probably even more likely, we're not perfect. Some of us write code here. We don't write perfect code all the time. If there's a bug, if there's downtime in a solver, you will see a lot of routes just go offline, right? And what does that mean for you if you're mid-transaction or if you're in the middle of some cycle and you really want to pump or dump, right? So there's a lot of systemic risk in terms of bridge routing and the effect on the end user. The solvers also face their own risks, right? And I don't want to just single them out as having systemic risk for their ecosystem, but let's also talk about the risk to them. There's very complex capital management that solvers have to do. And now we're in this ecosystem where we've got RAS providers popping up, all different kinds of sequencing, whatever, this stuff, and it's creating an explosion of chains, an explosion and fragmentation of liquidity, and then these solvers have to basically navigate all of this, and it's not easy. And we've seen this other point, the second point here in previous talks, solvers are at the mercy of oracles and messaging layers. Like if one of those things were to go down, there's a good risk that a solver is not going to get repaid. And we need more robustness in those systems to handle that. There's also bonding and dispute resolution and challenge resolution, and that's a big risk for solvers. And these are not well-tested code paths. I mean, let's be real here. Most people focus on the happy path. Most people are not testing the unhappy path thoroughly. So, there's so many potential failure points in those unhappy paths, and solvers might not get repaid. So that's another big problem for them. So how can we empower more solvers, and how can we why? Well, why do we need to empower more solvers? To address some of these concerns. We need more redundancy. We need more capital at play here. We need more oracles. We need more messaging layers. We need distribution and redundancy on those too. So how do we empower people to actually contribute to these problems and actually deliver solutions? Well, there are people working on things. This is by no means comprehensive. There's people in this room working on things, but I've just highlighted a few. A lot of people are trying to tackle this problem right now. Some are tackling it through standardization. We've heard other people here talk about standardization. So this one I just highlight is Uniswap and Across, collaborating on in ERC to standardize cross-chain intent bridges. Hopefully through some standards, we'll get more people building on top of those standards. It'll be easier to reason about these systems. Another example, Everclear had a really great blog post from a month or two ago about clearing layers and this concept that they're trying to introduce, making it easier for assets to be netted across different solvers, helping to solve the liquidity fragmentation issues and bring more solvers into the ecosystem. Minor Shill here, Nomial, my company, we're trying to connect solvers to LPs, to open public liquidity, so that solvers don't need to keep capital on all these different chains. They can borrow capital and repay on a single chain, making it, again, easier for solvers to operate, lowering capital risk, bringing more into the ecosystem. That's the hope. So here are some links. I will share the presentation on my Twitter profile or whatever on X, and so you can go click these things and read more about it and see some of my sources for what I'm talking about today. And that's about it. Here's a link to the slides if you want it. Everyone's bringing out their phone. I think I came in about 8 minutes.